Hey everyone, does life ever feel like just a random series of totally meaningless events? If we're all just physical matter that's eventually going to return to the dirt, it's pretty easy to see why someone might feel that way, right? Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're diving into some genuinely fascinating concepts from the text Love Infinite, and we're zeroing in on Chapter 1. It asks a really profound question: what actually is a true life? To cure that feeling of emptiness, the source proposes something it calls the spiritual view of life. We're going to map out exactly what this framework looks like, how it completely redefines human existence, and the specific methodology it lays out for actually finding happiness. Let's get into it. So, here's our roadmap for today. First, contrasting worldviews. Then, the Fourfold Path. Third, the unexpected trials. Fourth, spiritual marriages. And finally, the power of reflection. All right, starting off with part 1, contrasting worldviews, material versus spiritual. So the text argues that to fix things, we first have to identify the actual root of human despair. Think about the materialistic view. In that worldview, human life is just a temporary physical accident. You're born, you live for 80 or 90 years if you're lucky, your body goes back to the soil, and that's the whole shebang. The author points out that if this is true, then human civilization, morality, philosophy, they're all essentially empty, just temporary comforts for doomed creatures. But contrast that with the spiritual view. This whole framework operates on the idea that you are actually an eternal spiritual entity. Your soul is just temporarily inhabiting a physical body here on Earth, basically for a short period of learning. The text makes it absolutely crucial to understand that fully embracing this 100% spiritual worldview is step 1 to escaping an empty existence. To really drive this eternal nature home, the text uses a great example: a newborn baby. When a child is born, it's this tiny 3,000-gram vessel, right? It has severe physical limitations. It can't walk, it can't talk, its brain isn't even fully developed yet. But according to this spiritual worldview, that tiny infant actually houses a fully mature, eternal soul. I love this because it perfectly illustrates the core message here. Human dignity doesn't come from our physical capabilities or material stuff, it comes from that eternal breath of life inside us. All those physical constraints, they're just part of the earthly curriculum. Moving on to part 2, the Fourfold Path, a methodology for living. Okay, so if we accept the premise that life is basically a spiritual school, how are we actually supposed to live it? Well, the text lays out a very specific methodology for finding happiness, and it calls this the Fourfold Path. It's made up of 4 interconnected principles: love, wisdom, self-reflection, and progress. The author literally guarantees that if you stick to these 4 principles, you'll walk a path of true happiness and avoid bringing any misfortune on yourself in the afterlife. So let's break down exactly what each of these means. First up is love. Now, the key takeaway here is that the source totally redefines love. It's not something we desperately try to get from others, it's an action we initiate. In this context, the principle of love is explicitly about giving. It tells us to actively give love to others with a compassionate heart rather than just waiting around to receive it. It's a very outward-facing philosophy. Then we have the second principle, wisdom. And it's really cool how this builds on the first one. The text uses this striking visual metaphor for wisdom. It's not about just memorizing a bunch of random facts. It's about deeply learning spiritual truths and turning that knowledge into a literal lantern. The author says this lantern will illuminate your feet while you're walking through the dark night of earthly life. So, wisdom here isn't just academic, it's a practical, guiding light. The final 2 principles balance each other out perfectly: self-reflection and progress. Look, because we're eternal souls stuck in these physical bodies, we are absolutely gonna make mistakes, driven by earthly desires. It happens. Self-reflection is the tool we use to correct those mistakes and get back on track. But we can't just stare in the rearview mirror, right? We have to look forward. And that is where progress comes in. It's about striving towards a better future while holding on to those spiritual ideals. The text argues that using these 4 principles every single day transforms a mundane life into a truly spiritually grounded one. Which brings us to part 3, the unexpected trials, prosperity, and adversity. So even with a solid methodology, life is rarely easy. I think most of us assume that a trial in life only happens when things go terribly wrong, right? Periods of despair, hardship, massive disappointment. But the source makes this fascinating distinction. It points out the hidden trials of prosperity. The author argues that periods of extreme success, elation, and overconfidence, those are actually unexpected trials in disguise. Think about it. When everything is going perfectly and you feel like you're on top of the world, that is the exact moment you're most at risk of a spiritual downfall, mostly because it's so easy to lose your humility and gratitude. I actually want to read you a direct quote from the source because it hits the nail right on the head. Humans are tested in two places, when they are elated and when they are disappointed. The text is super emphatic here. Maintaining humility and self-discipline during our highest highs is just as crucial, and honestly, sometimes way harder than pushing through our lowest lows.
All right, part 4, spiritual marriages, bonds, and fidelity.
So how does this big picture spiritual framework apply to our closest, most intimate human relationships? Well, according to the text, our deepest bonds aren't just random earthly encounters. The source makes a really fascinating claim about marriage. It asserts that, generally speaking, marriage partners are decided on as pre-birth agreements. Yeah, before even being born into this physical world, souls make a specific promise in the afterlife to find each other, build an ideal home, and contribute to society together. And because of that spiritual origin, the text places a massive amount of weight on marital fidelity. It's not framed as some outdated, traditional rule. It's seen as a literal cosmic duty. By staying faithful, partners are honoring that sacred pre-birth promise they made back in the spiritual realm. The author points out that across major world religions, like Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, the strict rules against infidelity are there for a highly practical spiritual reason. They protect the family unit from destruction and ensure a stable, loving environment to raise children.
Finally, part 5, rebuilding life, the power of reflection.
So, what happens when we mess up? Because we will. The source is very realistic that humans are fallible, but it offers this incredibly powerful mechanism for redemption: deep, sincere repentance. According to the text, genuinely reflecting on your mistakes and sincerely repenting allows for absolute forgiveness from the divine. It literally gives you a completely fresh start to rebuild your life. To back this up, the author points to some really striking historical examples from two major faiths. In Christianity, you have Mary Magdalene, and in Buddhism, a figure named Ambapali. Both of these women were courtesans, meaning by the moral codes of their time, they were considered deeply sinful. And yet, because they embraced spiritual teachings and underwent profound, sincere repentance, the text says they returned to the afterlife as highly elevated, noble spirits. This message of hope is perfectly captured in this quote from the text. By repenting, pass through the gates of faith. If you do so, your sins will be forgiven. The author insists that no matter how far off track someone has gotten, sincere self-reflection is basically an eraser. It allows anyone to be reborn as a new person, totally capable of living a true, spiritually aligned life once again. Wow. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground today. We went from the fundamental differences between the material and the spiritual, all the way to the Fourfold Path, the hidden dangers of prosperity, the spiritual roots of marriage, and that incredible power of repentance. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to really ponder. If you viewed your life not as a temporary physical accident, but as an eternal spiritual journey, what would you change today? How would you treat the people around you, and how would you view your own personal trials? Something to think about for sure. Thank you so much for learning with me today. Keep asking questions, keep seeking structure, and I'll catch you on the next explainer. Hello and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating. Whether you're looking at human behavior through a strictly psychological lens or a more spiritual one, there's no denying that our darkest internal struggles, things like feelings of inadequacy, envy, and fear, are totally universal. We all feel them. So today, we're going to unpack a highly specific, really intriguing framework that's designed to essentially conquer those exact ailments of the human mind. Let's get right into it. Our source material for this deep dive is a book called Infinite Love by Ryuho Okawa. And what's really cool about how this text is structured is that it's not just some abstract philosophy. It essentially serves as a spiritual diagnostic manual for human suffering. It literally categorizes our core emotional struggles and then prescribes very specific faith-based mechanisms for overcoming them. We're going to impartially map out exactly how this text constructs its arguments to offer a pathway out of all that mental anguish. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The human struggle explained. 2. Conquering inferiority through faith. 3. Escaping the jealousy trap. 4. Healing fear, poverty, and illness. And finally, 5. The power of infinite love. All right, starting off with section 1, the human struggle explained. So let's kick things off with a question I think we can all relate to. Why do we, as humans, seem so hardwired to gravitate toward negative emotional states, even when we're trying our absolute hardest to just be happy? Well, according to this framework, the human mind is primarily trapped by three core elements. First up is crippling inferiority, which basically comes from this endless cycle of comparing our own worldly qualifications to everyone else's. Second is destructive jealousy, that burning resentment when you see someone else succeed. And third is paralyzing fear and poverty, which stems from feeling totally disconnected and helpless in the physical world. The author diagnoses these not just as bad moods, but as actual spiritual sicknesses, and as we'll see, prescribes a very specific cure for each one.
Moving right along to Section 2, Conquering Inferiority Through Faith. The author posits this really fascinating idea. In the grand scheme of the spiritual world, your worldly qualifications, they simply do not matter. To anchor this, the text actually draws on the author's own very personal experiences with language barriers and feelings of inferiority during his stay in America. It's a modern, highly relatable anecdote. But then, the text masterfully contrasts that personal story with a brilliant historical parallel from early Christianity, specifically looking at the psychological profiles of the apostles Paul and Peter.
This comparison perfectly illustrates the text's core point. On one side, you have Paul. The guy had literally every societal advantage you could want back then. He was highly educated, fluent in 3 languages, and held the immense privilege of Roman citizenship. Yet he was tortured by a deep inferiority complex and massive guilt over his past persecution of Christians. Now flip the script to Peter. Peter was an uneducated fisherman. He only spoke Aramaic, which severely limited his ability to preach to wider audiences, and he suffered a massive inferiority complex precisely because he lacked that worldly knowledge Paul had. They were complete opposites in status, but completely united by the exact same crippling human emotion. The crucial takeaway the author makes here is that intense, unwavering belief in a higher power is the true mechanism to conquer these deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. When you measure yourself against the divine, the text argues, both Paul's impressive resume and Peter's extreme lack of one are equally meaningless. Faith acts as the ultimate equalizer. It fundamentally erases the sting of an inferiority complex because you're shifting the baseline of your self-worth entirely away from human comparison. It's a total paradigm shift.
Let's dive into Section 3, Escaping the Jealousy Trap.
Now we have to tackle an even darker, much more volatile emotion described in the text, the consuming fire of jealousy. And to explain just how dangerous this emotion is, the text zooms way out, away from human history and straight into deep cosmic lore. It maps out the mythological fall of Lucifer as the ultimate cautionary tale. We're talking over 100 million years ago, involving a powerful angelic being in the 9th dimension. The text explains that this being became intensely jealous of its own ideal. Consumed by this fiery envy, the angel literally plummets to the lowest realms and becomes Lucifer. It's presented as the absolute quintessential example of jealousy completely destroying the self. But why exactly does jealousy destroy us? Well, the author explains what we could call the spiritual physics of this emotion. Think about it. When you burn with jealousy towards someone who represents everything you want to be, your ideal, you're actually generating a negative psychological and spiritual force. By putting them down in your mind, the text argues, you are subconsciously rejecting the very traits you desire. That creates a vector that pushes you further and further away from ever achieving that ideal yourself. It is quite literally a self-defeating trap. So how do we break free from that? The text introduces a highly specific conceptual cure called the heart of blessing. It's defined as the ultimate spiritual antidote to the poison of jealousy, but it's not easy. It requires the ability to sincerely, genuinely celebrate the success and happiness of others. The framework argues that by blessing the person who embodies your ideal, you realign your own mental energy with that ideal. It completely neutralizes the destructive, repelling force of jealousy.
All right, Section 4, Healing Fear, Poverty, and Illness.
Moving into a much brighter space, how does this belief system address the paralyzing, tangible grips of fear, poverty, and physical illness in our everyday lives? The text introduces a really powerful visual metaphor to combat fear. Believers are encouraged to establish what's called a pillar of faith. Imagine a massive vertical column of pure belief that pierces straight through the dense earthly realm right up into the heavenly world. According to the source material, constructing this internal pillar acts as an absolute shield. It protects your mind from all the random, chaotic fears that constantly swirl around in human society. Now, when it comes to physical illness, the text details a very specific prayer and practice called El Cantare healing.
The absolute non-negotiable prerequisite here is the premise of faith from both the healer and the recipient. And what's super fascinating about the mechanics of this framework is its view on distance. While the healing can be performed directly in front of a sick individual, the text explicitly states that remote distance healing works with the exact same efficacy. Why? Because within the logic of the system, spiritual light and intention are completely unbound by earthly physical distance. You can transmit it across the globe instantly. Finally, we've arrived at Section 5, the power of infinite love.
Let's see how all these diagnostic concepts and cures build toward the grand, overarching theme of the text. The author concludes that true liberation only happens when a person fully taps into this concept of infinite love from God or Buddha. Accessing this state promises to eradicate those self-punishing loops of inferiority. It completely replaces the isolating fires of jealousy with a mindset of mutual forgiveness and abundance. And most importantly, it awakens the realization that every single human is fundamentally a child of the divine. The argument is that without this realization, we're just blindly stumbling through trial and error using our own extremely limited power, which of course ultimately leads to suffering. I want to highlight this really powerful quote directly translated from the text. It reads, "If you truly believe, the wonderful nature of the Buddha will manifest from within you. The glory of the Buddha will surely liberate you from poverty." This just synthesizes the core argument of the entire framework perfectly, right? It's the profound idea that genuine, unshakable faith doesn't just comfort you. It actually fundamentally rewrites your reality from the inside out, manifesting both spiritual and physical abundance. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've journeyed through a highly structured spiritual diagnostic manual today, from the crippling traps of inferiority and jealousy to the liberating concepts of the heart of blessing and infinite love. So I want to leave you with one final thought to reflect upon. When you're faced with your own internal struggles, will you allow the self-defeating fires of jealousy and comparison to dictate your reality? Or will you choose to build your own internal pillar of faith? Thank you so much for learning with me today, and I hope this framework has offered you a fascinating new perspective on conquering the human mind.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into some truly profound metaphysical concepts. We're zeroing in on Chapter 3 of a fascinating piece of source material to unpack its intricate theology. We'll be looking impartially at exactly how it defines the human soul, the invisible world, and the ultimate purpose of spiritual practice. So let's get right into it.
Okay, let's set the stage. The text we're analyzing today is Infinite Love by Ryuho Okawa. Right out of the gate, the author makes some incredibly definitive, uncompromising claims. You see, this isn't presented as just some abstract philosophy. The text outlines a literal, invisible world, active divine beings, and a highly structured cosmic hierarchy. Our goal today is simply to map out these exact claims, giving you a clear picture of the core framework the author is presenting.
To do that, we're going to follow the book's exact progression. We'll start with the human condition, move on to the divine revelation, take a look at the spiritual conflict, and finally wrap up with the spiritual resolution.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the human condition.
Before introducing any specific deities, the text establishes a really interesting philosophical baseline. It actually argues that the capacity for faith is the definitive dividing line between humans and animals. According to Chapter 3, animals just don't possess faith at all. Humans, on the other hand, have this unique, inherent ability to perceive the sacred and believe in the invisible. The text claims that recognizing this unseen reality is literally the ultimate proof of our humanity.
Which brings us to Section 2, the divine revelation.
Here, the text introduces its central theological framework, and chief among this is a figure identified as Lord El-Kantara. The author describes El-Kantara as the highest god and the ultimate leader of what's called the Earth Spirit group. The text even breaks down the linguistic meaning of the name for us, explaining that El-Kantara translates to the beautiful land of light, Earth, while simultaneously signifying the victory of Buddha.
Building on this divine authority, the text then outlines 4 actionable teachings. These are presented as absolutely essential principles for modern humanity to really engrave in their hearts for a new era. They are love, wisdom, reflection, and progress. Now, the text goes into a lot of detail defining these steps, but I want to highlight 2 specifically: love and reflection. The book defines divine love not just as a warm emotion, but as a highly practical exercise in empathy. It's literally about putting yourself in another's position and strictly avoiding doing to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself. Reflection, on the other hand, is presented as almost a rigorous internal audit.
It requires this constant, unflinching self-examination of your own thoughts and actions to ensure they align with the sacred. But, any structured path to progress usually implies that there are obstacles along the way, right? If we're meant to be marching toward this spiritual ideal, we have to ask, what exactly threatens this progress? What is the counterforce here?
That leads us right into Section 3, the spiritual conflict.
The author doesn't pretend this spiritual journey is unopposed. In fact, the text introduces a very literal threat. It states that Satan and evil spirits are unequivocally real. The book actually goes out of its way to stress that these are not just metaphors or fairy tales. They're described as real, active forces working to drag people away from divine truth and deliberately plunge humanity into misfortune.
So how do we deal with that? Let's look at Section 4, the spiritual resolution.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the text says a person is supposed to survive this literal spiritual warfare. The author actually redefines a pretty common concept. In the face of this active evil, the text prescribes prayer, but definitely not just as a passive request. The text explicitly commands the reader to use prayer as a weapon of light. It frames faith as this active, tactical defense against dark forces.
And the mechanics of this defense, they're fascinatingly structured. The text emphasizes that you are never, ever supposed to fight this evil using your own individual ego or solitary strength. Instead, the strategy relies completely on unity. By exercising pure faith, believers supposedly unite with El Contere and the entire heavenly spirit group. The author claims that when you tap into this massive collective energy, the dark forces simply cannot resist or withstand the light.
So, the really crucial point is this. The author's ultimate thesis is that when you completely abandon your own ego power and exercise absolute, pure faith in this divine hierarchy, the result is literal miracles. The text promises that this level of pure belief generates power so immense that it transcends all normal human limitations. We're talking about the ability to overturn time, space, and even the course of history itself.
The entire doctrinal framework of Chapter 3 essentially culminates in this one definitive guarantee from the author: believe and miracles will definitely happen. It's a remarkably bold, uncompromising conclusion to a highly structured metaphysical argument about the sheer power of the unseen world.
Which leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to walk away with today. Regardless of your own personal theology, the text poses a really fascinating philosophical challenge. Think about it. If, as the author claims, the capacity for faith is the single greatest proof of our humanity, literally the very thing that separates us from mere animals, how much of your own daily life is actually driven by a belief in things you cannot see? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.